The obvious thing is that when something feels pointless, it is really demotivating and frustrating, right? Like, you're paying your mortgage because you have a good reason for it. But, like, how many people like standing in long lines or being on hold and going through 10 different phone mazes where you keep entering the same information over and over, right? Like, that's totally not motivating. And in fact, pointless work is actually a form of torture. This is how people were tortured in work camps, was carry this pile of boulders to the other side of the camp, and then the next day you're gonna carry it back. Like, it's actually really degrading to the soul to have to do that kind of work. But at the same time, people will do extreme work, like really working their bodies by choice, right? Because they have a different narrative for the reason for doing it. And so meaningful narratives are really central to, as we've been talking about yesterday and today, the narrative you have for things has a huge impact on the experience you have of whatever it is, whether it's the reason for working hard, or whether it's your narrative about what social cues mean, or what's your narrative about what failure means. Narrative is really the central thread that runs through all of this. And so these two researchers have spent decades, as I said yesterday, studying these core psychological needs and autonomy. Autonomy is a really central need that we all have to feel like we are choosing to do whatever it is we're doing. And it really completely changes our experience of that thing, that we're doing it because we want to. And it really, we already talked about that. So this is what's interesting, though, is that the exact same action can have a very different narrative and be very differentially motivating. And in this study, they looked at trash collectors' reasons for their job, like what was their narrative about what they were doing. And they found that trash collectors who had a narrative of cleaning up their community were a lot more higher levels of well-being, and they're also more effective at their jobs. So we did this activity. What are students' narratives for why they're working hard, right? And obviously we came up with a lot of different reasons. And this one, obviously, I have to do this boring assignment because my teacher told me to, is one of the kinds of narratives that often students face. And we even maybe reinforce those because it's like my history teacher, it's like, just don't question me, just do this assignment kind of thing. So you can imagine that if a student feels like their autonomy is not being honored in this interaction, it could be very demotivating for them. So a better narrative, it's boring, but I can see how it relates to my life, and I can see, how it might help me make a difference in the world. Is that really possible? Can we take these really boring things like, yeah, okay, maybe learning algebra isn't really your thing, but how do you make a meaningful narrative out of something like that? So is that just pie in the sky, right? But what we have found is that you can actually help students change the meaning of these things that they may otherwise perceive as doing it for somebody else's reason or doing it something that's just totally boring. So in the first one, we're going to look at some work by Chris Holloman and his team. They're at the University of Virginia. And so they asked the question, like, is understanding, how what I'm learning relevant to my life? Does that change the narrative for students? And so giving them opportunities to connect their coursework to their lives. And so in this study, they've actually replicated this now and shown the same effect in larger samples. But in this study, they had 262 high school students, 2 high schools, 7 science teachers, and what they did was they just gave students a notebook, and they were given opportunities about every couple of weeks to or at the end of every module. So if they were doing a module and it took a week, they would do it at the end of that week. And there was no grading for this. There was no teachers were looking at it, the researchers were looking at it, but there was no evaluation component to it. It was just take some time right now to reflectively write about how what you're learning relates to your life. And they found that just doing that activity It really increased their interest, it increased their scores in the class, and had a really powerful impact. Even though it may look small, it was just a very simple activity for them to do, right? And so what Chris Holloman has been working with Angela Duckworth's lab, Character Lab. Have any of you heard of Character Lab? So Character Lab was started by Angela and her team at the University of Pennsylvania to try and take these kinds of interventions and first of all, like, support them in scaling up the work to see how we can actually make this, like PERTs, make that effective on a large scale, but also to design, they're designing what they're calling playbooks that are turning these into activities that can be done by teachers in a way that can sort of reinforce this idea of relevance for students. And so we're going to actually do that activity now because I put it in your handouts. It looks like this. It's called Build Connections. If you want to just take a moment and fill that out, just think about, you can fill it out for just this module that we've been talking about, or you can fill it out for what we talked about yesterday. So it's interesting that you brought up, like, it's going to help me change my teaching, which I think is really awesome, right? To think the more you get to know your students, the more you're going to be able to think about how this work, how whatever you're doing might be relevant to their lives. But I want to just highlight, too, the important piece of this work and these interventions is the self-generation part of it. And so don't, like, think the back and forth and how you learn about it is brilliant. I think that that's one of the gifts of this tool, is that if you collect these and you look at those, you are going to learn a lot more about your students. But don't ever, like, remove the self-reflection piece. I would really strongly encourage you to continue to do that piece so that they have an opportunity to make that meaning for themselves, because it'll be really different for everybody, right? This is great that you're also engaged in this, but I want to also be mindful of moving on, so if that's okay, we'll move on. But I do want to just add one piece to what you just said, because it reminds me of this awesome, like, one of our favorite practices that came out of the collaboration we had with Los Angeles Unified School District and those 3 teams of teachers was, pardon me, a long-term English language learner teacher, Juan, did this amazing thing with his students. It was somewhat similar in that he created a Facebook survey because he was getting kids all the time, like in the middle, like there was no continuity in his class. They were just like showing up with 0 English, and I would come and visit his class regularly, and I was always just amazed. Like, this girl shows up and she only speaks Mandarin. He doesn't speak Mandarin, but 3 weeks later I show up and she's talking in class, and I'm just like, what are you doing? So he finally shared that he would give every student who came in a Facebook survey. So he would find somebody who spoke her language that would help with the translation. I don't know how he managed to communicate after that, but he carried around a clipboard with him with the surveys from kids. And so when he was talking about any subject, he would call on, he did the cold call technique, but he would always reference what they were learning to speak about to some interest that kids had reported on their surveys. And these kids were just riveted on him. Like, they were so engaged, and he trained the class. They all, like, cheered every time one of the kids spoke. So there was, he also did really amazing belonging practices where the kids were supporting each other's learning. And I just really was truly amazed at the progress that I, as an outside observer, could see in his students. And it was that piece about seeing the connections, connecting what he was helping them learn about to their interests, but he was also integrating that with the belonging practices. So I was noticing that some of you were talking about, like, how this is also helping kids, helping you feel more connected to your kids. So hopefully you're seeing these connections for how these different mindsets all link together and support each other. So, okay, let's move on to purpose. So these 2 constructs are very similar, but they're also a little bit different. They're so we are at 9:30. I was going to go until 10-ish before a break. Are you good with that? Okay. So they're related, like making connections between what you're learning in your own life is motivating, but there's this extra piece that comes in with the idea of purpose, which is that when our core psychological needs are all met, we feel competent, we feel socially connected to those around us, it's actually pretty innate for us to want to give back. And it's very motivating to feel that you are able to give back to your community. It reaffirms your sense of competence and your relationships, right? But it's that autonomy piece that has to be in there where you're doing it because you choose to do it. So this beyond the self goals is how it's sometimes phrased, is incredibly motivating. And as Nietzsche put it, he who knows the why for his existence will be able to overcome almost any how. So thinking about these different kinds of beyond the self purposes, there's different levels of purpose. There's self-oriented component where you're motivated because something is really intrinsically, sorry, this thing is falling out. It's intrinsically motivating to you. But there's this other piece, as I said, of the self-transcendent. And this piece turns out to be really important for especially cultures that are more interdependent. So Latino cultures tend to be more interdependent. Asian cultures, when you look at like different socioeconomic groups, people that grow up in poverty tend to have more interdependent. And if you think about it, it makes sense because you're, sorry, this is distracting me. Okay. When you're in a situation where there's very few resources, and this was very true in my family, where you end up having to all pitch in together to be able to exist, right? So my mom went back to work when I was 12, and I was put in charge of making dinners like everybody else in the family. And so at the age of 12, I had no idea how to cook. I was given the joy of cooking and told to just look in the fridge and see what was there. And I was cooking for 9 to 12 people, you know, so, and I'm so glad that I had to do that because everyone in my family learned to be really good cooks. And we all sort of joke about it because my mother was a terrible cook and it was survival. But so these different, growing up in these different communities can actually elicit this kind of self-transcendent, like being part of a group and helping the group survive is actually just sort of comes through naturally in a lot of communities. So what David Yeager, who you saw in the video yesterday, wanted to explore is the question of having a self-transcendent purpose for learning. Does that affect students' persistence? And so what they did was looked at, really tried to get a broad range of students and focusing a lot on students who are from those underrepresented communities. So 90% of the students in this study were on free or reduced lunch. And they were surveyed in the spring semester of their senior year. And in a lot of these schools, they were in sort of schools that were doing like Yes Prep. Is any of you familiar with Yes Prep? Yeah. Yeah. Houston. That's where one of the groups of schools. Oh, awesome. Yes Prep is really great. Yes Prep, KIP, there's all kinds of different schools where they do a lot of support to get kids ready to go to college, right? So a lot of kids in this study were all fully prepared to go to college. They had applied and were on their way to college. So it was a select group of students for that purpose to see like there's a chronic problem. You may be, I don't know if your schools are tracking kids who are going to college, but there's a real problem with persistence, right? Especially for first generation students. And so what they wanted to see was, is there a difference between having a self-transcendent purpose versus not in terms of those students who are likely to persist when they do get to college? And so these were the questions that they were asked, that they were the survey questions that they were responding to. And they just were asking, how true are these for you? I want to learn things that will help me make an impact on the world. I want to gain skills that I can use in a job that helps others. I want to become an educated citizen that can contribute to society. And so then what they were looking at was the degree is 1 to 5 of how much they endorsed these goals for going to school. And the percentage on the y-axis is how likely they were to be enrolled in college at the end of, oh, now I'm forgetting exactly when it was, 6 months after after they had enrolled in college. How likely were they to still be enrolled? And what they found is that the more likely, like the higher level of endorsement, was correlated with greater persistence in college once they got there. So taking this information and seeing like, okay, it seems to have an impact, then the question became, can we actually support students in developing, like making it more salient for them to have a self-transcendent purpose for learning? And so from that, David worked with our team at PERTS to design an online module designed very similarly to the growth mindset intervention, where there was the sort of peer norms, you read quotes about students. It was tailored so that I actually was part of getting this. We actually found students in those different communities to audio record the passages that students were listening to when they were going through this program so that they could hear it from students who shared a similar accent. So that was quite fun, finding students to do these recordings and getting them to figure out how to do it online. But it ended up so that when the students were going through it, they were reading it about students in their local community and about students who were going to their school or their college. And so they also had that reflective writing piece, which I didn't include that slide, but there's just like, these are some of the reasons. What are you interested in? What are your interests in the world? What problems do you care about? And then giving them an opportunity to write about how what they're doing as a student might help them to be able to address those problems that they care about. So it turns out this study, this is a really great book if you're interested in sort of just general, like what helps people be more effective in their jobs. And it was Morton Hanson looked at 5,000 different adults, you know, it was a really broad, all different kinds of professions, looking at what makes people most effective at their jobs. And it turns out that having a meaningful why for what you're doing increases your productivity, your persistence, your well-being. Kind of not surprising, right? Like if you actually feel motivated about what you're doing, if you have that Japanese, like why do you get up in the morning as the central drive in your life, it's not surprising that that would be more, you would have higher well-being. So what was interesting in this book, I thought, was that he really broke down different kinds of passions or purposes. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to think about your own purpose for teaching. And I'm going to pass over a story that I was going to tell you for the sake of time. But first I want to play you, have any of you seen this video? Ah, that's so funny. Okay, so we won't do that. Did you already do a writing activity about your purpose for teaching? So we won't do that again. I'll tell you about Danny instead. So before I even learned about all this work, I told you about my story, about like what helped me overcome my total fear of not being smart enough to go back to college was that sense of purpose, right? Like when I saw that I actually really cared about the challenges that were being faced by people in the communities in Los Angeles, I really wanted to give back. And part of my job as director of this counseling center was that we worked very closely with gang intervention and gang prevention programs. And so I sat in on case supervision every week where these social workers were talking about all the different, the families that were trying to keep their kids from joining gangs and all of the issues that they were facing. There was another component of the same program that was called Bridges, that they were actually working with the older kids, trying to get kids out of the gangs who had already joined. And all of the people who worked in that program were former gang members themselves. And so one day they sent over some paperwork that I had to sign for a grant that we were getting together, and the two guys who came to my office, I knew that they were former gang members. And I was like, this is probably, I don't get that many opportunities to sit down and talk to them. And I said, do you have time to just come and tell me a little bit about your story? I'm interested in hearing about how you got out of the gang life and how this program has affected you. So Danny, there was two of them, but Danny's story really struck me. He said, I was a really powerful gang member. I had a lot of money and I had a lot of power. And he said, I really liked it when I walked down the street and people crossed the street to avoid me because they were afraid of me. He said, I liked that. It gave me a lot of sense of power. And he said, I liked the fact that I had money and I could buy my mom a car. So there was a lot of things that were very motivating for him about being in the gang lifestyle. He said, but then, and he told me about his experience of, like, when you're in a gang, you don't get to go to the hospital when you get injured. And he lifted his shirt and showed me a scar that ran from his sternum all the way around to his back, and it was a knife wound. And he said, I sewed that up myself. So I was like, that's a different lifestyle than mine. And so it just gave me a sense of just his like grit, right? His resilience to be able to do that. And then I said, so you obviously had a lot going on that was very motivating. Why did you leave? And he said, well, I got into a situation where I committed a crime that was putting me into adult court. So I didn't push him on this, but I have a feeling that it was pretty serious for them to take a 16-year-old and put them into adult court. So he said, they gave me a choice. They said, you can either go into this Aztecs Rising program where they teach you how to be a firefighter, and you can do that for, I think it was 2 years, or you can go to adult prison or adult court and get, prosecuted and probably go to jail. He said, I chose the firefighting. And then he said, what happened was, he was just doing it because he was told to, right? He was doing it because he had to. But there was a big fire that was really close to the edge of a community called Glendale, right near where I live, actually. And it was threatening a lot of people's homes. And so one day after firefighting, he was in a gas station, and he went into the store, and he was paying for his stuff, and he heard all this cheering behind him, and he thought that some celebrity had walked in, and he turned around, and they were cheering for him. And because he had his uniform on. And he said that was it. He was like, I had never experienced being valued by my community before. And he said that feeling of them being so grateful for what he was contributing changed his life. And so he was working to get kids out of the gang, but he was also enrolled in college. And I wish that I had stayed in touch with him and knew what had happened to him and what he'd done with his life afterwards. But I just felt like of any story about purpose and that feeling of how your sense of purpose is connected to your feeling of belonging, I just feel like his story really captures that. What I want to do next is return to the activity that we did earlier and reconsider those reasons for students trying and those purposes for learning, given the purpose and relevance information that we talked about, and also just revisiting the self-determination theory, where the core psychological needs related to this theory are on the left. So how they connect to the mindsets that we've been talking about is on the right, and I just put some sort of bridging sentences there between the two. So now I want you to go back to your to the post-it notes that you made earlier and how you categorized those, and to think about those again, about why students engage, and see if you changed your opinion about any of those in terms of thinking about how do they help students connect to a sense of like personal internal motivation. And so you can just, maybe they'll stay the same, but just to think about the role of autonomy and choice in those reasons. And I know that there was a lot of discussion that was really great around like that interpretation can be the same purpose but can be interpreted differently. So maybe just have a little more discussion about that and put those little M's, plus M, minus M, or neutral, and see what your thoughts are now and how they relate to those bottom three. All right, so we'll just take like 10 minutes for your groups to go back to your post-its and then give you a chance to do a last gallery walk. So how much choice they have can have a big influence. And we're actually going to look at a couple of pieces, but I didn't talk about that too much, but just giving students a choice can actually really change their sense of autonomy, even if it's a class that they have to take. And I'm going to show you a video of a teacher who designed tested out that theory in his own class. Any other thoughts? Reflections? All right, so just want to now turn to, we went through this, did you want to do a gallery walk and see? It seems like you had a pretty good, like everybody was pretty much on the same page, but you're good? Okay. So let's just look at a few more elements of like different teaching strategies that can support the sense of purpose, relevance, autonomy. And so like I just mentioned, this piece about autonomy, when you feel like you have choice in the matter, it actually really changes your relationship to that activity. And there is like research that I could have shown you on this, but I'm going to just show you actually a teacher who did some improvement science testing of this idea in his own class in a minute. Project-based learning, obviously, a number of you have talked about how you're already doing that. Do you guys want to talk just a little bit? How many of you are doing project-based learning? Just a show of hands so that I can see. So for those who aren't, would one of you maybe just give an example of what that looks like in your school or in your subject area? Or that's great. Yeah, where kids can see a real-world impact of what they're doing, I think is just really a big shift that's happened over the last decade or so in education that I think is really awesome. So I just want to show you a couple of videos. Well, we did the WHOOP we did, and then the last one I think is something that you can think about with students is to help them brainstorm the reasons for why. That I don't know, a lot of times that doesn't actually happen, you know, like I described of my experience of really wanting to understand why I was being asked to do something, and just like, had the teacher just turned around and said to the class, let's all brainstorm ideas, that would have really changed my relationship with that class. So I encourage you to think about that if you're not already. I'm sure some of you are already doing things like that. Whoop, oh yeah, I guess I didn't put, it's not actually, it's funny, on their website they call it WHOOP, but then when you print out the document it just says Building Connections, but it's the Character Lab Building Connections activity. All right, so this is a teacher who is in Chicago who was part of a 3-year project where they took a group of teachers and taught them all about these different mindsets, and then also showed them improvement science strategies where it's the plan, do, study, act cycle, where you're thinking about like, what is the problem I'm trying to solve, what kinds of things could I test, how will I know if it's working, and then these teachers came up with their own strategies and collected their own data. What I love about his practice is that he really designed it so that it was like identical, and there was one condition where it was choice, exact same problems, and days where there wasn't. And so he's not even building in relevance or anything else. He just showed just having choice changes your engagement. Another activity, this came from a teacher that I interviewed who is part of the ELs, one of the EL schools, and he designed this activity for his English class where he got students to pick their own song lyrics and then to take those lyrics and turn them into grammatically correct sentences and not losing the meaning of it. And so it's very simple, but that element of just letting them pick a song that they care about, and this is on the PERTS Mindset Kit, so you can also look this up and download it there. But it was so simple, and I just thought that it was really creative. So just in summary, we all know now meaningful narratives are really important for all of us. And students who can see their schoolwork as meaningful are more motivated, and these brief kinds of activities can really help children, kids, all of us really think about having a different narrative for these. We've kind of already talked about these, but there they are again, having a meaningful why. It's really important to respect kids pushing back, right? Like, really understand that as coming from a need for autonomy. If you think about like the kids that are resisting, I think that this can help shift that approach to thinking about why that might be. And again, we've been talking about this all day, but I just wanted to give you a chance to talk in your groups a little bit about how you're seeing these different mindsets supporting each other. And if you want, we have more chart paper. If you want to do a concept map, that also might be a fun way to sort of think about building these relationships. But it's up to you. You have choice. You can decide how you want to have this conversation. And it's probably fine to stay in your table groups. We're going to move around after and do the brainstorming, and I'm going to suggest that you move into content or grade level groups at that time. So we'll give you like another 10, 15 minutes. We'll see how you're doing at 10-minute mark and check in. But just see what you're thinking about in terms of how these fit together, why they fit together, and what happens to students' motivation when one piece might be missing in terms of in relationship to the other two. What I actually was talking about was this idea of when are people more resilient to stereotype threat, and it has to do with their domain identification. And so what the research has shown is that the more competent you feel, and if you're really strongly identified with that field, so if you're a woman in math and you're going into that as a career, and you know that there's this stereotype out there, or you don't, doesn't matter, like you're susceptible to that stereotype threat, but if your sense of commitment to that domain and your feeling of competence are really strong, you're not going to be as vulnerable to stereotype threat, because you're like, this is it for me, this is who I am. But that piece, that vulnerability about where belonging might actually cause the fluctuation of like, oh, am I competent enough or not? Do I believe I can get better, but maybe not. That actually is when you're sort of in the vulnerable zone of being pretty identified, but not quite sure of your competence, or maybe not as grounded in your sense of I can improve and grow in this area. So there's nuances to this. And I think that in some ways what you're saying is absolutely right. I know that for me, in my graduate program, I was a fish out of water in that group. They were all teachers, and I was coming in from this very quantitative background, and so I was more critical of the research we were reading, which didn't make me come off as like, I wasn't quite as sensitive as I could have been in the beginning, and then you've set the tone. So I actually didn't feel deeply identified with that group. I didn't feel a strong sense of belonging, but I still got a lot out of the program because I had a growth mindset. I was like, okay, I screwed up and I've lost that opportunity to form those really strong bonds early on. And you know, I just realized like my sense of identity and self-worth are not dependent on this group because I had a strong relationship outside. So there are ways that, we talked about this right in the beginning, right? How your sense of belonging outside can actually buffer you against a feeling of threat. And so you still could have a growth mindset in that domain. So I think that it's both. I think that everybody's perspective here, we're all just talking about the nuances, right? We're not saying one thing is right or wrong, the other is wrong. And if your school doesn't have a growth mindset orientation and your practices are in conflict with the school's, that's really tough for people too, right? So there's another book to add to the list, is Michael Fullan's Coherence. And Michael Fullan's done really amazing work looking at school systems around the world that are really high functioning and how they have adopted basically everything he describes really fits nicely with all of these things we've been talking about. They have a school level embracing this idea of continuous improvement. He doesn't call it growth mindset, but it's essentially the same thing. So there's convergence around constructs that people define in different areas of research, but they're all essentially the same. And don't get bogged down by the labels and the jargon, right? Like the underlying principle is the same. And Peter Senge is another one who also talks a lot about the role of like really taking a student-centered approach, thinking empathetically about what, you know, it's like what's going on with a student. So there's some really great thinkers out there about how to actually deal with the whole culture level of the school and the school system and what needs to change. So yeah, lots of exciting stuff happening right now. Yeah.